I'm Ivy Prosper, your host for Nature Answers. In this episode, we're going to do something a little different. We're going to take you to the Media Institute of South Africa's Zambia office, or as we call them, MISA Zambia. Farm Radio International has partnered with MISA Zambia for many years, including on our nature-based solutions project funded by the Government of Canada. Today, you'll hear an interview by Claire Hutchin, one of the Carleton School of Journalism interns that spent some time working with the team at MISA Zambia. In this interview, she talks to Austin Satali, the Assistant Programs Officer at MISA Zambia, about our partnership, about local listening groups, and radio programs, and their impact, as well as how radio continues to make an impact on the lives of many. If you missed our last episode, it's worth listening to it for context, but not necessary. Now, over to Claire and Austin.
All right. So can you just clarify for me what your role for MISA is and with the Nature-Based Solutions Listening Groups project?
Okay, so the role for MISA, basically we are an implementing partner on the NBS project with support from Farm Radio, where we try to engage communities and look at ways on how we can mitigate effects of climate change.
And can you describe exactly what your role is for the radio stations, with the radio stations, and along with the listening groups?
So we support radio stations. Currently we're working with 4 radio stations on the project, just to ensure that the radio programs are running, and also ensuring that working with the communities, they develop radio programs that speak to the needs of the community members.
And so do you like check in with the radio stations regularly to see how things are going?
Yes, we do. Once the programs are up and running, we do have weekly check-in meetings with them. So this is where they get to share information about any challenges that they could be facing, or just any regular updates that they may have for us.
So how do you yourself and MISA Zambia ensure the listening groups and farmers are engaged through your work and with the radio stations?
So, like I mentioned, we try as much as possible to ensure that we include them in the definitions, in the discussions, and the development of content that's going to air on these radio programs. So their voices still remain an important factor for us, so that even as we're airing these radio programs, we have them in mind and they get to participate.
Just going off of that, when I was speaking with some of the listening groups in the Eastern Province, they mentioned that they really enjoy that they're able to call in to the experts and ask questions. Is this something that the radio stations have implemented? How do you feel that this makes them feel included in what's going on air?
So actually that's one of the things that we are happy about in the implementation of these radio programs with our partner stations. We get to hear the side of the listeners, who are largely the farmers. So there are times where they are unsure about certain farming practices. So when we do host panelists who are specialists in their own right, so these could be gender experts, this could be NBS experts, it gives them that opportunity to interact and to ask those important questions of these farming practices that they may not be sure about, and some of the gender dimensions to community setup and the like. So it has been a beneficial feature for our radio partners and for us as well, because we get to hear the voice of the farmers.
Another thing that I noticed when I was out in the field and speaking with them, they're all wearing the same blue shirt that happens to say MISA on it. And a couple of people even pointed out that they loved the message on the back, which is people should listen to the radio and tune in to the radio. So why do you think having that almost as a uniform for the listening groups is important when they're out in the communities, showing that MISA is there and cares and is listening to what they have to say?
So that was also one way of, it was actually, I think one of the requests that came from them. It was also one way of, sort of to have an identity, so to say. And then with that identity on them, as they walk around in the community, they have that message on their back. So for someone who's not familiar with the radio programs that are supported by, MISA and Farm Radio, they, you can ask a question, what's this, message on your back? And then from there, conversations then begin. So that in itself also allows them to be, ambassadors of, the project that we are doing and the radio programs that run on those radio stations in these respective implementing sites.
And so does MISA, since this is their pilot program, do they have any say in what is aired on the radio stations, or is that entirely up to the journalists and the reporters who do the nature-based solutions programs?
Oh yeah, so we do have a say. So the way we do the radio programs is a collaborative effort. So we have our design meetings where we engage our broadcasters. We also engage members of the community who we come together and identify NBS practices that are useful and seeing how then we can craft content that speak to issues on the ground. So it's a collaborative effort. MISA, Farm Radio, the broadcasters, and selected community members.
So are you basically saying that, like, if something severe were to happen, so like last year's drought, would you then tailor what is being told, the nature-based solutions on the radio that are being projected have something to do with that? So here's this way you can combat this current issue. You would tailor them to what people are experiencing.
Yes, exactly. So it's basically what we would do. It's not something that we actually impose, but we work with what they're experiencing currently. So we would look at the situation on hand and some of the best farming practices that are applicable in that particular region. So you would find a farming practice that is done in Eastern Province may not be the same farming practice done in Mongu in Western Province. So we would tailor content based on the issues on the ground in that respective province.
How often are you checking in with the radio stations and the listening groups, MISA as a whole or yourself?
So for me, with the work that I do check in with the radio stations on a weekly basis. Then when it comes to the radio listener groups, I think that depends also. It could be, bi-monthly. It could be, after 3 months. So largely, I think it also depends with the needs that they have at that particular time. We realize that climate change and biodiversity loss are some of the issues that are affecting communities right now. So we are trying to work with the communities, work with our farmers to see how best we can then counter that. How are we doing that? We want to use the indigenous knowledge and develop knowledge that is nature-based. Something that is cheap, something that is affordable, and something that is workable. Because chemical fertilizers in the long run doesn't, do the soil any good. So the issue now is how do we work with our communities and see how we can implement initiatives that also take advantage of the indigenous knowledge to try to counter some of the effects of climate change.
So when you say indigenous knowledge, you mean like the traditional farming practices when it was just all nature-based. But have you found that people have been willing to go back to that because it's something that they know, or has it been so long ago that they're finding it a little bit difficult to go back and stray from what they currently know, which might be chemical fertilizers?
So it's something that is there. So there are others that are actually doing it, but they just didn't label it that way as a nature-based solution. But when you look at practices that we promote and look at what they are already doing, so there are some that are actually already doing that. So it's just the naming that is, different. We call it the nature-based solutions. Others will call it, smart agriculture. Others will call it, indigenous. So different names, but basically talking about the same thing.
So, but do you think that some people are having a hard time going back to that? Or in most recent years, with the effects of climate change being more visible, more people are more willing to do whatever they can to combat?
I don't think they're having any challenges going back to, using, the indigenous knowledge that, was passed down by their forefathers. It's something that they actively doing, and those that are not doing is something that they look forward to actually going back to do. So it's not something that is foreign, but it's knowledge that was always there, but they instead perhaps chose to explore, chemical fertilizers, for example. But now, looking at the long-term effects that has on the the land, on the crops, it's something that people are now willing to go back to.
So what issues did MISA first see 3 years ago that led to the Listening Group's project implementation? What were you trying to resolve?
I think it's largely the issue of ensuring food security at household level, and also trying to counter the effects of climate change, but not leaving anyone behind. So that also meant making room for women, for youths, and it's not only men who are doing this. So it's doing all that, but also taking into consideration the needs of our women, because when you look at it, they are the most that get affected when you look at issues of climate change. So when there's water scarcity, they are the most who are affected. When they don't have electricity supply in that community, in that village, and they need to gather firewood, who does that? And it's the women. And with the cutting down of trees has only meant that women now have to walk longer distances than to go and find or fetch firewood. So to a large extent, women have been affected. So it's about how do we counter the effects of climate change, but also ensuring that we add issues of gender in there to also look at the needs of the woman, and also not forgetting the youth.
So going off of that, do most of the listening groups have a combination of all sorts of people, youths, men, women, etc.? Or are there listening groups where it's just women, just youths, just men, just older folks?
Yeah, so we have a combination of all the above. We have groups that have, combined men, women, youths. We have groups that are only for women. We have groups that are only for youths. So that was also a deliberate effort to just try to promote and encourage participation, especially for the women, because there are men and women combined in the same group. But when you are having these discussions, there are some women who would tend to shy away from participating. So to also encourage participation and ensure that everybody is able to express themselves, we have had groups that are solely for women and others that are just for the youths, and combined groups.
What is the significance of listening to the radio in these rural communities, rural farming communities, compared to other forms of communication? Why radio, basically?
Well, I think radio is one of the oldest forms of communication that we have had. We have gone through the times, technological changes, but radio has always been there and is still there, and even to this day has proven to still be relevant. Yeah, it is easily accessible, it is cheap, it transcends geographical barriers, so that way it has a wider reach. So even in areas where people struggle, rural communities, people have shown that they still have high regard for radio. So it presents an opportunity for engagement. People also love to hear a voice on radio that they are able to relate to. If I live in community Y, community X, and I'm able to hear about a colleague from the same community sharing their experiences, their success stories, I listen to that, I become interested, and I would also want to, hear myself or let others hear my stories or sharing stories on radio.
What do you think is the biggest difference between listening to the farm radio program by yourself as a small-scale rural farmer compared to listening it with a group of people?
So I think it presents an opportunity for knowledge sharing when you're listening to these radio programs as a group. So where you're not sure, you get to ask colleagues. Where you are facing challenges practicing or implementing a certain NBS, you have a chance to ask someone who may have had success in the area that you are currently struggling in. So there's that opportunity that it gives where you're able to, look at what other colleagues are doing and also learn from them. So there's that interaction and also allowing for knowledge sharing and knowledge exchange between, farmers on what, best practices and what really works and what doesn't when implementing, a specific NBS.
And have you noticed when you do your check-ins, either with the radio stations or bi-monthly check-ins with the listening groups themselves, what is the biggest shift you've noticed in how the farmers in the communities and listening groups are talking about climate change since before this initiative began?
You can definitely notice enhanced knowledge, especially on issues around climate change. So people now do realize that climate change is here, and it is real. There's knowledge built up around that topic. There's also, enhanced knowledge now on some of the practical ways that people can now implement to counter some of the effects of climate change. So, for example, soil erosion, soil infertility. So then, based on their interactions with the other colleagues as well, who may have been faced with the same challenge but now know what to do. People now, they know more about, what they need to do, what climate change is, and, just, way forward, where do we go from here based on what we have now. So there's definitely that. I don't know whether we can take the credit for that, but there are also other stakeholders that work in the same field, talking about climate change and also engaging communities at different levels. We have government, doing that, also pushing the Smart Agriculture Initiative. We have other, NGOs that also promote, indigenous knowledge and, indigenous, application of farming methods. So there has been that shift that is now noticeable, where you can sit and have a conversation with someone about, climate change, and they'll be able to elaborate about climate change, the challenges that, it brings, and some of the practical solutions that certain communities have and, are willing to implement.
And so, in your experience, how is the knowledge that the farmers are gaining from the radio programs improving their overall livelihoods?
So having to hear an expert, an NBS expert, share knowledge on what works and what doesn't work, and how to improve soil fertility, how to improve your yields, how to improve your harvest, so to say. It definitely helps them because they get to apply that knowledge that they get on radio, and getting it from an expert who's featured on the panel. It helps because when they go to apply that in their respective farms, a difference is seen in terms of what they're able to harvest based off on the knowledge that they could have heard on radio, or from a colleague who also practices a particular NBS. Instead of using chemical fertilizer, but they're able to practice certain NBS, or just basically knowledge that they got from listening or benefiting from a radio program. Then they go and try out that farming practice or that NBS. So you get to see that maybe the harvest when you were doing this practice was bad, but then when you shifted and did this practice based on the knowledge that you got from a radio station, then there's a difference in terms of what you're able to harvest. You could have been harvesting 10 bags, but after you change farming methods, or you start practicing an NBS based off on a radio program that you heard, now you're able to harvest 15 bags. So there's that knowledge that is acquired through these radio programs that also helps then and means that they're going to have that difference in terms of what you're able to harvest before and after.
Well, thank you. I don't have any more questions. Is there anything that we haven't discussed that maybe you were hoping we would get to talk about, or something that you think people listening would want more clarification on when it comes to the listening groups?
I think we've tackled largely everything, but just to mention that radio still is relevant. It's a powerful form of communication that we have, especially for our rural communities. Easily accessible and promotes interactions, and people just love to hear themselves on radio. I mean, if the radio program has a call-in session, we actually encourage our radio partners to have a segment that allows call-in, where farmers, listeners are able to call in, either ask questions or add on to what the experts in the studio are talking about, get to contribute. That goes a long way in helping our listeners and also just share knowledge about climate change, because climate change is real and it's here to stay. So we continue sharing knowledge just to ensure that we can, tackle this problem and ensure food security.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was Carleton School of Journalism intern Claire Hutchin and MISA Zambia Assistant Programs Officer Austin Sitali. Thank you, Claire and Austin, for taking the time to share their insightful conversation. We want to thank the Government of Canada and Global Affairs Canada for their commitment to funding work on nature-based solutions. Thank you to our partners at the Carleton School of Journalism and all of the students who took part in this season of Nature Answers. Thank you to the communities who welcomed us and shared their inspiring stories. Thank you to everyone who supports these community visits to introduce us to members of these communities and translate our interviews. Good luck to all the Carleton Journalism students who are getting ready to visit new communities this summer. Thank you to John McGill, our editor for this season of Nature Answers. As this is the final episode of this season of Nature Answers, we want to thank you, all of our loyal listeners, for tuning in to each episode and sharing it with friends who are also interested in climate solutions. Our next season of Nature Answers will be here before the end of the year. As always, I'm Ivy Prosper, coming to you from Accra, Ghana. Thank you for listening to Nature Answers.